Aloha, I'm Bárbara Bruno from the University of Hawaii, and it's my pleasure to be here today. I'd especially like to thank the organizing committee for inviting me. And if you only take one thing from this talk, it's the importance of developing relationships first before doing anything else. And as obvious as this sounds, this is a lesson that we've learned the hard way in Hawaii. Because researchers at our university have not always been respectful of the communities in which we do our work, we've lost the trust of some of those communities. And I'm hoping that Geoheritage will offer us a path to heal as a community. So I'd like to share my screen now. And hopefully you can see this, my slides here. And I would like to start today with a land acknowledgement. I am a settler on this Aina. I recognize that Her Majesty, Queen Liliuokalani, yielded this Aina to the United States under duress and protest to avoid the bloodshed of her people. As a settler, I seek to support the varied strategies that the indigenous peoples of Hawaii are using to protect their land and their communities. I commit to dedicating time and resources to working in solidarity. Mahalo. The first part of this presentation will be a review talk. I'll start with some background on the geology and geoheritage, as well as the history and culture of Hawaii. I'll draw connections between Hawaiian culture and science to debunk the myth that Hawaiian culture is against science. And finally, I'll share about a geoheritage project that we're just getting underway at Haleakala on the island of Maui. I'd like to start with the geological context. Hawaii is a hotspot in the North Pacific Ocean. It's the center of this ring of fire. And as the Pacific Plate moves to the northwest, the Hawaiian Islands form. So these are the main Hawaiian Islands. This is the hotspot here. And this island is called Hawaii Island. It's also called the Big Island. And then we have here Maui that I just mentioned, where Haleakala is, and the islands age as you go to the northwest, and Kauai is the oldest island at about 5 million years old. There's also a Hawaiian legend of how these islands form, and the short version is that Pele, the goddess of volcanoes, sailed to Hawaii from Tahiti. She landed on Kauai, and then she continued her journey through the islands. And on each island, she dug fire pits or volcanoes. So she dug her first fire pit, the oldest fire pit, on Kauai, and then the youngest fire pit on the summit of Kilauea volcano, where she currently lives. So this legend also explains the relative ages of the islands. And I don't think that's a coincidence. It's reasonable that Hawaiians knew the relative ages of the islands simply by observing them because they look different from each other. So on the left, we have Hawaii Island, the youngest island, and there's a lot of black lava rock on this island. On Kauai, the oldest island, you'll see much more greenery. The cliffs are much more eroded. It looks older. So there's a lot of information in Hawaiian legends. You just have to look for it. And there's also a lot of information in Hawaiian names. In fact, we get the names from lava flows from the Hawaiian language. In Hawaii, most of our eruptions are lava, and we have two types of lava. Chemically, they're identical. They're both basalt, but they look very different because they're emplaced in different ways. So these are the Hawaiian definitions here on the right from Pukui and Ebert. And A'a flows, they burn and they blaze, they glow like fire. These are fast-moving flows in open channels. Pahoehoe, on the other hand, flow more slowly, they're more fluid. They produce smooth, unbroken type of lava. So there's a lot of meaning in these Hawaiian names. Now I'd like to look at two volcanoes on Hawaii Island. They're both active volcanoes. Mauna Loa means long mountain, while Mauna Kea means white mountain for the snow-capped peaks. Mauna Loa is the Earth's largest active volcano. It last erupted in 1984, and it's a gently sloping shield volcano. This is how Hawaiian volcanoes look when they're young. Because they're made primarily of fluid lava, they can't build steep slopes. Mauna Kea is also still active. It last erupted about 5,000 years ago. It's in the post-shield stage. It's one step older than Mauna Kea. So superimposed on the shield are these cinder cones, these more explosive eruptions, giving it a steeper, bumpier shape. And this is the tallest mountain in Hawaii, and it's prized as an astronomical observatory. Here are some of the telescopes. Now, if you've heard of Mauna Kea, it's probably because of the controversy surrounding the TMT, or 30-meter telescope. The proposal is to build a telescope that's much larger than any of the existing telescopes. And this has generated a lot of protests, especially from the Native Hawaiian community. Why are they protesting? Because the mountain is considered sacred. It's probably the most sacred place in Hawaii. Because it's the tallest point on Hawaii, it's considered to be a connection to the heavens. And in ancient times, only the highest ranking ali'i, the highest ranking Hawaiian chiefs, could visit it. It was forbidden to everyone else. In fact, Mauna Kea is considered to be family to Hawaiians. Papa and Wakea are the ancestral parents of Hawaiian chiefs. And you can see in this oli here that Mauna Kea is considered to be the mountain child of Wakea. So in other words, Mauna Kea is related to the Hawaiian people. So often protesters at Mauna Kea are dismissed as being against science, and Hawaiian culture is often presented as well as being against science. But that's not true. Science is and has always been an important part of Hawaiian culture. And to show this, let's go back in history. Native Hawaiians are Polynesians, the first people to travel to Hawaii. They may have arrived as early as 300 AD from places like the Marquesas Islands or Tahiti. And they traveled thousands of miles across the Pacific Ocean to get to Hawaii. And this required advanced knowledge of oceanography as well as astronomy because they navigated by the stars. And when they finally settled in Hawaii, which is believed to be about 1,000 years ago, they set up a thriving agricultural system. Each island was divided into these large land areas that run from the ridge to the reef, called moku, and these moku were subdivided into ahupua'a. So this is the island I live on. It's called Oahu. It has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 moku, each stretching from the summit ridge to the ocean. And each of these moku are divided into these slices called ahupua'a. So I live in the moku of Kona and in the ahupua'a of Waikiki. So if we were in ancient Hawaiian times, each ahupua'a would be ruled by a local chief, and it would contain all the natural resources needed for the people to live sustainably. So you didn't go borrowing resources from the neighboring ahupua'a because you had everything that you needed. And this system of land division shows a knowledge of ecology and of the connection between summit and coast. And at the coast, there were thriving fish ponds, which are currently being restored. But this ahupua'a system did not last long after the Europeans arrived. So the first Europeans arrived with Captain Cook in the late 1700s. And then soon after, the missionaries and businessmen arrived. And with them came Western ideas of land ownership, culture, and religion. And the businessmen saw the high economic value of Hawaii's rich agricultural land, and they replaced the ahupua'a with these large sugarcane plantations. And largely, but not exclusively for economic reasons, the businessmen, along with the help of lawyers and the US Marines, overthrew Queen Liliuokalani. And that was soon followed by Hawaii being annexed as a US territory in 1898. And then in 1959, Hawaii became the 50th state of the United States. And so this is relatively recent history. And as you can imagine, there's understandably a lot of resentment about this from Native Hawaiians. So I look at geoheritage as an opportunity to bring people together, to bring together different knowledge systems, such as Western scientific perspectives and the traditional ecological knowledge of Hawaiian culture. It's an opportunity to make connections between scientists and kupuna, Native Hawaiian elders who are the keepers of this traditional knowledge, as well as to connect people to the environment. Geoheritage can empower youth and instill in youth a sense of pride and responsibility. And I'm hoping it might even give us an opportunity to heal as a community. So what I'd like to do now is describe the Geoheritage Project that we're just beginning. It's on the island of Maui. So Maui is made up of two volcanoes, West Maui Volcano and East Maui Volcano. This is East Maui Volcano, and this is the summit area of East Maui Volcano called Haleakala, or House of the Sun. And in the background of this image, you can see another island, Hawaii Island. And this is Mauna Loa, the long mountain, and Mauna Kea, the mountain that is sometimes covered with snow. So in establishing this project, we really wanted to take a relationship first approach. We wanted to build positive relationships, pilina, with Haleakala Park staff before doing anything else. So we started by consulting the Kulana Noi, which are guidelines on building ethical relationships between the University of Hawaii and the community. And these guidelines tell us that it's important to show respect for history, for people and place, that relationships should be reciprocal and not extractive. We should be aware of our intentions and the power and the value that we have to the place, both as an individual and as a representative of the university. And communication should be two-way, inclusive, and transparent. So I reached out to Haleakala to first find out if they were interested in exploring a relationship with the University of Hawaii, and if so, to listen and learn about what they would want, to find out what their goals would be. And I learned that they were really interested in engaging with the local community in Hawaii and in particular on Maui. Most of the visitors to Haleakala National Park are tourists from the US and from other countries. So they were interested in increasing the visits by local Hawaii residents, and they were also interested in partnering with local scientific and cultural organizations. They wanted to strengthen and perhaps expand the interpretation programs that they offer visitors, so education programs about the park. And what they really wanted was training for their park interpreters. Park interpreters are the park rangers who deliver the interpretation programs to the visitors. And they didn't want to get training from a single expert in a single field, but they wanted broad-based training from a team of presenters. And they wanted the presenters to be diverse, including Indigenous Native Hawaiians. And I also wanted to follow best practices in the field of geoheritage. So last year, my colleague Ann Wallace and I reviewed the geoheritage literature to learn about best practices, summarized here. And the one that I want to focus on today is continuous evaluation. So rather than just evaluating when you're finished with a project, the recommendation is to evaluate it throughout the lifetime of the project. So in our case, this project involves a week-long training of Haleakala park interpreters. So we started with a front-end evaluation. So before we even started developing this programming, we did a pre-survey of the prospective park visitors, the people who would participate in these educational programs, as well as the park interpreters who would deliver the program. Throughout the week-long training, we surveyed the participants who were the park rangers every day, and depending on what they felt worked and what needed improvement, we changed the next day's agenda accordingly. And at the end of the week, we did a summative or formal program evaluation, which we administered online. So the first survey was prospective park visitors. I surveyed 80 people. They were all physically located on the island of Maui. Most were residents of Hawaii, and about a third were residents of the island of Maui. And just over 20% were tourists from the US and international destinations. I found that most of them had been to Haleakala National Park before, but very few of them knew that Haleakala offered educational programs. So this in itself is very informative because it tells us that if Haleakala National Park wishes to attract more local residents, they need to advertise that these programs are available locally. There was strong interest in attending these educational programs on Haleakala, both in Hawaiian culture and history, as well as all of the science topics that we put on the survey. For the Haleakala park interpreters, there are a total of 13 employed by the park, and 10 of them responded to our survey, so a response rate of almost 80%. And most of them are from the mainland US, and they've only been in Hawaii for less than a year. So think about this. They're employed to deliver an interpretation program about a place that they're only beginning to get to know. So this is a very challenging situation to be in. So it's not surprising with these results that this was a key goal of the Haleakala park staff was to get training. They were interested in every topic we mentioned. Of the 10 respondents, at least 9 said they were interested in all of the choices we gave them, and all 10 were interested in geology. They were also highly interested in Hawaiian culture and history. In particular, all of the respondents said they wanted to learn about Hawaiian legends and place names, as well as Hawaiian cultural protocol. And we wanted this training to be a two-way exchange of information. We didn't want to simply be lecturing at them. So we asked them what they would like to contribute to the training. And there was interest in particular about contributing stories and knowledge. So this is the key units that we did throughout the week. We did culture and we did science, Western science every single day. These are some of the areas that we focused on. And we ended the week with a paina, which is a Hawaiian celebration. And this was an in-person workshop. Because of COVID, And also because some of our presenters were based on the US mainland, we did have remote participation, both of presenters and some of the park interpreters. But most of the participants and most of the presenters were there in person at Haleakala for this week-long training. We used a variety of pedagogies in the time that we spent in the classroom. We had presentations, we had workshops, we had activities, we had time for reflection. We spent a lot of time practicing Hawaiian cultural protocol. There are a lot of chants or oli in the Hawaiian language. And because Haleakala is the house of the sun, one of the chants that we practiced was e ala e, which is a chant used to greet the sunrise. We practiced this every day, and then on the last day, these are the park interpreters, we went to the summit. We got up at about 4 in the morning, drove up to the summit, and we greeted the sunrise by chanting this. And to give you a feel of what that was like, I'd like to play you a YouTube video. And if you'd like to follow along with the lyrics are here. You pronounce them pretty much the same way you would in Spanish, except the W is a V. So let's see if this works.
E ala e kalai kai kina I kamuana honu Pi kalevanu I kahikina ayakala E ala e kalai kai kina I kamuana honu Pi kalevanu I kahikina ayakala E ala e kalai kahikina I kamuana honu Pi kalevanu I kahikina ayakala E ala e.
Pretty powerful, yeah. And we went on a lot of field trips, focusing on geology, looking at lava flows, cinder cones, dikes, looking at the crystals in the lava flows. And we picked locations that were near the visitor centers because this is where the park interpreters deliver their education programs from. So the closer we could be to the visitor center, the more likely they would be able to incorporate this information into their programs. And every day we did an informal evaluation to get formative feedback. And we asked them to answer these 3 simple questions. And I'll share some sample responses to these questions. For the first question, 2 things I liked. They liked that there was a large range of presenters, including Native Hawaiian presenters. They liked that we mixed up the teaching methods. And they really enjoyed the opportunity to connect with colleagues and presenters. For 2 things I learned, they appreciated that the Hawaiian culture, values, and legends. They mentioned a lot of scientific facts, for example, that each volcano in Hawaii is unique. And many people drew parallels between Hawaiian culture and science. As far as one thing that I'm confused about or would like more information about, this question will guide our future trainings. They want information about Olelo Hawaii or the Hawaiian language. They'd like to learn more about Hawaiian chants, the oli, and when they're performed, just like the sunrise chant is performed at the top of the summit of Haleakala to greet the sun. Each chant has a specific time and place associated with it. One thing we did not cover was Haleakala history, and we didn't cover much about climate change specific to Haleakala, and these are things they're interested in. And they also wanted to get some guidance on how they should talk about some controversial issues, such as telescopes, in their interpretation programs. And then at the end of the week, we did a summative evaluation, and some of the questions took the form, compared to before I took this workshop, I now have a better understanding about, and they can state their level of agreement or disagreement to these questions on this 5-point scale, ranging from strongly disagree to strongly agree. And these were the 4 topic areas. And they mainly agreed and strongly agreed that they have a better understanding of these topics. For climate change, that there's obviously some work we need to do there. They also said that compared to before I took this workshop, they now will enjoy doing their job more, they're more confident, they feel more connected to colleagues, and they have a deeper appreciation of Haleakala. They were very positive in their feedback for instructors and the workshop itself. Everybody agreed or strongly agreed that the instructors were knowledgeable and approachable, that the workshop was respectful toward Hawaiian culture, and that they would recommend the workshop to a colleague. And this is just the beginning. It's the first of hopefully quite a few trainings. And the lessons learned so far, the first one is just fundamentally about the importance of establishing a relationship with the park staff first and finding out what their goals were, as opposed to, for example, us going there with a plan in mind and saying, hey, we got a grant and we're interested in delivering this kind of a program for you. And it's really important to maintain a long-term focus, because while this project is funded through a grant from NASA, Haleakala Park staff doesn't really care when this grant begins or ends. As far as they're concerned, if they're investing in a partnership with us, they expect that partnership to be long-term. I learned to resist assumptions because several of the presenters had done extensive research at Haleakala. I had assumed that they had a relationship with the park staff, and in some cases that was not true. I also learned that national parks and academia work really differently. Academia tends to be very informal, while the national parks are governed by strict rules. I learned that flexibility is essential, especially under COVID. We were delivering this in-person training at 7,000 foot elevation on Haleakala when we were following social distance protocols. So there was no classroom large enough for this. We ended up delivering this program in a garage with very spotty internet connection. So there were a lot of logistical challenges, and I'm really grateful for everybody's flexibility. And this last point is something I didn't learn specifically from this project, but it's more a gradual, I guess, change in my attitude. When I moved to Hawaii in 1988, and for the first decade or two after that, I really didn't feel comfortable incorporating Hawaiian culture into any of the presentations I gave. I thought I was trained as a scientist, so I should stick to science. And I also thought it might even be cultural appropriation or disrespectful to talk about Hawaiian culture, since I'm not from Hawaii, let alone native Hawaiian. But over the years, my attitude on this has changed. I now look at it as my responsibility, as everybody's responsibility, to talk about Hawaiian culture. Whether I'm from Hawaii or not, I've made Hawaii my home. So I feel it's part of my responsibility as a scientist to honor our host culture. I'd like to acknowledge all the people at Haleakala who helped organize the training and participate in conversations. I'd like to thank the workshop instructors, the team at the University of Hawaii, and our funding sources, the NASA survey program with additional support from an NSF grant. So I'd now like to thank you, mahalo. I'd be happy to take any questions that you have. And I also have a question for you. I'd be very interested in learning more about La Palma as a possible TMT site and to hear your perspectives on that. So I'll stop sharing my screen now. And I will end the recording.